Most people never rise because they're shackled by invisible chains. Not enemies, not fate, but fear. Fear of rejection, fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of failing in front of others. Modern society gives it softer names: anxiety, insecurity, doubt. But Machiavelli would call it what it truly is: mental obedience. Fear is not just an emotion, it's a program. From childhood, you've been trained to obey it. Parents telling you not to stand out. Teachers punishing you for speaking out of turn. Friends laughing at your confidence. Failures you never reframed. A society that thrives on conformity, not freedom. Each moment a piece of code written into your mind. And now that code whispers before you move. It stalls your words, it controls your posture, it rewrites your decisions. You think you're being cautious, but in reality you're being obedient. This is where Machiavelli's neuroconditioning method begins. A brutal reprogramming designed not to comfort, but to kill. Not to soothe fear, but to starve it. This is not therapy. It is not journaling. It does not care about healing. It's for the man who doesn't seek comfort, he seeks power. And to achieve that, he must strip fear down to its roots and burn it out. Here's the first truth: fear is not you. It is an experience. And experiences can be dissected, broken, rewired. Most men drown in the feeling. They say, "I'm scared. I'm not ready. I'm anxious." But a Machiavellian man says fear is present. This is a surge. It will pass. He separates identity from sensation. Fear becomes a thing, and things can be destroyed. Your first step is to stand outside your fear. Watch it like a scientist at a crime scene. Feel the heartbeat. Notice the breath. Study the tension. Ask, what is the data here? Because fear is rarely real. It's a broken alarm echoing from the past. Your job is not to obey the alarm. Your job is to cut the wires. But here's the trap: most men believe they're strategizing when they're only avoiding. They say, "I'll wait until I'm ready. I'll move when the timing is right. I'm just being realistic." In truth, they're dressed up cowards. That's fear wearing a suit and tie polished, reasonable, convincing. Still fear. Machiavelli would argue, before the mind can rule, it must be brutalized. It must be reminded who is master, not through motivation, but through conditioning. Cold, sharp, daily conditioning. You don't erase fear by hiding. You erase fear by starving it of power. And the only way to starve it is to touch it every single day until it loses its grip. This is where the rewiring begins. You no longer call fear weakness. You call it data. You no longer run from fear. You dissect it. And when you stop believing fear is you, you begin the transformation. Because fear cannot survive when it is exposed. It cannot command when it is studied. It cannot control when it is treated as nothing more than information. And the moment you make that shift, when you stop obeying fear and start interrogating it, you've already taken the first step towards sovereignty of the mind. If fear is a program, then conditioning is the rewrite. And like any program, the only way to change it is not with theory, but with repetition. Brutal, deliberate repetition. Most men wait for courage to arrive before they act. That's why they never move. Machiavelli would scoff at this weakness. He knew the truth: action doesn't follow courage. Courage follows action. Think about it. The first time you speak up in a room, your chest tightens. Your voice trembles. Your mind screams at you to stay quiet. But if you keep speaking, if you push through again and again, something strange happens. The fear shrinks. Your voice steadies. Your chest loosens. Soon the very thing that once paralyzed you becomes ordinary. The monster becomes familiar. And what is familiar cannot frighten you anymore. This is why Machiavelli's neuroconditioning method demands exposure. He would say, step into fear until fear steps back. It's not about reckless chaos. It's controlled confrontation. If public speaking terrifies you, you don't just think about it, you speak daily, even in small ways. If rejection paralyzes you, you don't hide, you seek it out until it becomes powerless. The average man tries to avoid discomfort. The Machiavellian man manufactures it. He knows that every moment of discomfort is a microdose of power. It's rewiring at the root. And each repetition isn't just practice, it's a psychological war against the old program of obedience. But here's the key: you must keep the exposure sharp, not dull. If you tiptoe into fear half-heartedly, your brain still registers it as threat. You reinforce the program instead of breaking it. But if you face it fully, directly, repeatedly, the The brain has no choice but to adapt. It rewires, it accepts, it obeys you. This is how conditioning works in every domain of power. Soldiers don't become fearless by reading about war. They become fearless by drilling until the sound of gunfire no longer rattles them. Leaders don't become confident by journaling affirmations. They become confident by confronting critics until criticism feels like background noise. Confidence is not a gift. It's a scar. And scars are built only through repetition. So ask yourself what fear owns you. Is it rejection? Is it failure? Is it humiliation? Whatever it is, stop dressing it up as strategy. Call it what it is, obedience to an outdated program. And then begin the daily assault. Seek it, touch it, break it. Because once you understand that fear is not a wall, but a weight, you stop standing in front of it. You start lifting it. And like any weight, the more you lift it, the lighter it becomes. Machiavelli would remind you power does not belong to the man who waits for courage. Power belongs to the man who acts without it until it is no longer needed. And when fear finally learns to obey you, you will have crossed a line that most men never approach, the line between being ruled by the mind and ruling it. Most people believe fear disappears when you achieve success. They imagine that once they earn enough money, build enough status, or gain enough skill, fear will vanish. But Machiavelli would smirk at this illusion. Fear doesn't vanish, it mutates. The poor man fears failure. The rich man fears losing what he's built. The loud man fears silence. The quiet man fears being overlooked. Fear doesn't die with success, it adapts. And unless you rewire your relationship with it, you will always remain its servant. This is why Machiavelli's method isn't about creating a life without fear. That's impossible. It's about creating a mind that treats fear like weather, something to notice, but never to obey. Rain falls, wind howls, storms come, but you keep moving forward because you know storms don't last. Fear is just weather in the nervous system. The Machiavellian mind refuses to build its life around storms. And here lies the second layer of conditioning: anticipation. Most men are caught off guard by fear. They mistake its arrival as a sign to stop, but the strategist expects it. He knows fear will show up before the speech, before the risk, before the leap. And when it arrives, he doesn't panic. He nods. He says, "There you are. I was expecting you." The anticipation transforms fear from an enemy into a familiar guest. This practice changes everything. Because once you expect fear, it loses the element of surprise. And the loss of surprise is the loss of half its power. Imagine walking into a dark room. If the lights suddenly flicker, you jump. But if you knew beforehand the lights would flicker, you stay calm. The event hasn't changed, but your anticipation has. That's the conditioning. Machiavelli would argue fear thrives on ambush. Kill the ambush and you kill half the fear. This is why soldiers train with simulated chaos, why leaders rehearse worst-case scenarios, why strategists play out moves 3 steps ahead. They strip fear of surprise, and what remains once the shock is gone is manageable. The third layer of conditioning is reframing. The average man asks, "What if I fail?" The Machiavellian asks, "What will this failure teach me that no one else is willing to learn?" The question is no longer about survival, it's about leverage. Every failure becomes a weapon. Every mistake becomes intelligence. Fear loses its sting because loss itself has been rebranded as gain. So the conditioning looks like this: expect fear, welcome it, reframe it, and then act in spite of it. Over and over until your nervous system rewires itself to treat fear not as a stop sign, but as a signal that power is near. And here's the irony: once you stop trying to kill fear, you become fearless. Not because fear is gone, but because it no longer owns you. You carry it like a shadow, useful for direction, irrelevant for decisions. And that's when you finally understand the truth: fear was never the enemy. Obedience to fear was. Fear thrives in the dark. It grows strongest when it is vague, undefined, unspoken. The mind whispers, "What if?" and spins endless scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. But Machiavelli would remind us, vagueness is fear's greatest ally. To weaken fear, you must drag it into the light, name it, define it, strip it of mystery. This is the fourth layer of conditioning: interrogation. Not self-help affirmations, not soft words of comfort. Interrogation. Sit with your fear and demand clarity. What exactly am I afraid of? Losing money, looking foolish, being rejected? Dying, write it down. Speak it aloud. Once defined, fear becomes smaller, measurable. And what is measurable can be conquered. Most people avoid this exercise because naming fear feels like feeding it. But the opposite is true. Unnamed fear controls you because it's fog. Named fear shrinks because it becomes an object. And objects can be studied, broken, dismantled. The Machiavellian doesn't whisper to fear, he cross-examines it until it loses its mask. This is why great strategists prepare for every failure in advance. They list the worst outcomes, play them out in detail, and see what survives. Suddenly, the nightmare isn't so endless, it has borders. And once it has borders, it has limits. Fear without limits is terror. Fear with limits is training. But interrogation alone isn't enough. The next step is exposure. Not avoidance, not rationalization, direct exposure to the very thing you fear. If humiliation is your fear, you must allow yourself to look foolish until the sting disappears. If rejection terrifies you, you must seek it until it no longer bruises. If failure haunts you, you must fail deliberately, quickly, and cheaply until failure feels like feedback, not death. This is where most men quit. They want the crown without the scars. They want confidence without conditioning. But Machiavelli knew the truth. Confidence is not a state of mind. It's a state of proof. Proof that you've bled, stumbled, lost, and survived. Without that proof, your confidence is theater. With it, your confidence is steel. So the formula is brutal but simple. Interrogate the fear, define it, expose yourself to it, and repeat until the program breaks. Over time, the brain learns a new truth that fear is survivable. And once the brain accepts that, obedience collapses. The average man waits for someone to rescue him from fear. The Machiavellian rescues himself by dismantling it piece by piece. He doesn't ask, how do I avoid fear? He asks, how do I bend fear until it obeys me? And that question changes everything. Because when fear obeys you, every arena of life opens. Risks that once seemed impossible become routine. Opportunities that once looked terrifying become exciting. And men who still kneel to fear cannot understand why you move so freely. They see courage. You see conditioning. Fear has a habit of disguising itself. Sometimes it doesn't feel like fear at all. It feels like logic. It wears the mask of being practical, being patient, or waiting for the right time. But Machiavelli would tear that mask away. He would call it what it is, fear in costume. A decorated excuse for obedience. Think about it. How many times have you said, I'll start when I have more experience, when I have more money, when I feel ready? That voice doesn't come from wisdom. It comes from fear, whispering in a tone you mistake for reason. If you wait until you feel ready, you will wait forever. No one ever feels ready. The battlefield doesn't give you permission. You take it. This is why Machiavelli's method demands exposure now. Not later, not someday now. Because every time you delay, the program of fear strengthens. Every day you postpone action, the chains grow thicker. The only antidote is movement. Swift, decisive, imperfect movement. And here's the paradox. When you act in the presence of fear, you discover that fear was lying all along. You don't collapse. You don't die. You don't lose everything. You stumble maybe, but you survive. And survival rewires the brain. It proves the alarm was false. Each act of defiance becomes a new line of code. Slowly the program changes. Fear stops being the master and becomes the signal, a red flag pointing directly at the area you must attack. Machiavelli would say, the place where fear is loudest is the place where power hides. If rejection terrifies you, that's where freedom lives. If loss paralyzes you, that's where growth begins. If humiliation burns you, that's where dominance is born. The fear is not a wall, it's a compass. It points to the very field you must conquer. This reframing is critical, because once you see fear as direction, not obstruction, everything shifts. You no longer ask, how do I get rid of this feeling? Instead, you ask, what does this feeling reveal about the next level I must reach? That question turns fear into fuel. The average man runs from fear and builds excuses around his retreat. The Machiavellian runs toward fear, knowing it guards the gates of power. One dies waiting for the perfect moment. The other rewires his mind by attacking the imperfection of the moment he already has. So the fifth layer of conditioning is this: refuse the disguise. Don't let fear pretend to be wisdom. Tear away the mask. Call it out. And then strike where it tells you not to strike. That is the path to rewiring. That is the path to sovereignty. Because in the end, fear's greatest trick isn't making you tremble. It's making you wait. And the man who waits is already defeated. The sixth layer of conditioning is detachment. Fear thrives on your attachment to outcomes. You fear rejection because you crave acceptance. You fear failure because you crave success. You fear humiliation because you crave respect. Fear is always tied to something you think you must have. But Machiavelli would remind you power doesn't belong to the man who needs. Power belongs to the man who can walk away. When you detach, you break fear at its root. You no longer tremble at rejection because you no longer beg for approval. You no longer dread failure because you know failure is data, not death. You no longer fear humiliation because you've accepted that respect is borrowed, never owned. By loosening your grip, you loosen fear's hold on you. This doesn't mean indifference, it means sovereignty. It means moving into the arena fully engaged but free from desperation. When you play a game you don't have to win, you're unstoppable. Because the man who needs nothing cannot be controlled. Look at history's most dangerous figures. They were feared not just for their skill, but for their detachment. The general willing to burn his own bridges fights harder than the man protecting an escape route. The negotiator who can walk away always dictates the terms. The lover who doesn't cling always commands more desire. Detachment terrifies because it signals freedom, and freedom is untouchable. Fear only thrives where there is need. Kill the need and fear withers. This is why Machiavelli advised rulers to train themselves to expect betrayal, loss, and change. If you expect nothing as permanent, then nothing can shock you. And if nothing can shock you, fear has no place to live. So practice detachment in small, brutal ways. Say less than you want to. Give less explanation than they demand. Refuse to beg for second chances. Step away from deals that don't serve you. Walk away from people who drain you. Each act of letting go rewires the mind to release its chains. This is not coldness, this is clarity. When you detach, you stop bargaining with fear. You stop negotiating with ghosts. You stop living on a leash made of desire. And that's when you discover a freedom. Most men will never taste the freedom to act without trembling, to choose without pleading, to move without hesitation. Machiavelli would call this the supreme discipline, the art of walking away. Because the man who can walk away is the man who can never be broken. The seventh layer of conditioning is confrontation with death. All fear at its core is a shadow of the single truth: we are temporary. Rejection, failure, humiliation, strip them down, and they are fragments of the same fear, the fear of not existing, of not mattering, of being erased. Machiavelli understood that until a man confronts death, he will remain a slave to every smaller fear. Most people avoid this thought. They drown it in distractions, bury it in entertainment, silence it with routine. But the strategist does the opposite. He faces it daily. He meditates on death not as despair, but as liberation. When you accept that everything ends, love, wealth, reputation, even life itself, you stop clinging. And when you stop clinging, fear loses its anchor. The Stoics called this memento mori, remember you must die. Machiavelli took it further. Remember that others must die too. Enemies, rivals, critics, all of them are just as temporary. Their judgment, their rejection, their laughter all vanish when seen against the scale of mortality. Why obey fear of people who will one day be dust? This conditioning is brutal but freeing. When you hold death in your awareness, smaller fears shrink. The fear of speaking in public feels absurd when compared to the certainty of the grave. The fear of trying and failing feels laughable when time itself is running out. The fear of embarrassment dissolves when you realize no one remembers the mistakes of others for long. They're too busy hiding their own. Confronting death isn't morbid, it's fuel. It reminds you that hesitation wastes the one currency you can never earn back: time. Every day you delay, you hand fear another slice of your limited existence. Every act of courage is not just a victory, it's a reclamation of life itself. Machiavelli would argue the man who has accepted death cannot be ruled. He fights without hesitation. He speaks without trembling. He risks without apology. Because he knows the ultimate risk is already guaranteed. One day, he will lose it all. Until then, nothing else is truly lost. This is why death awareness is the sharpest form of conditioning. It doesn't just rewire the mind against fear, it rewires the entire life. You stop asking, what if I fail, and start asking, What if I waste this chance? You stop obeying fear's whispers and start obeying urgency. And that urgency is what makes you dangerous. While others wait, you move. While others cling, you release. While others obey fear, you obey time. The eighth layer of conditioning is domination of perception. Fear is not always born from reality. It is born from how we perceive reality. Two men can stand in the same storm. One calls it disaster, the other calls it training. Same event, different frame. Machiavelli would insist control the frame and you control fear. Most people hand their perception to the world. They let headlines dictate their mood gossip, dictate their confidence, and setbacks dictate their worth. They experience reality as victims of narrative. But the strategist rewrites the story. He says this loss is not punishment, it is rehearsal. This rejection is not humiliation, it is redirection. This silence is not emptiness, it is power. With each reframing, fear is starved of its venom. This is why Machiavelli taught rulers to manage appearances. Not just how others saw them, but how they saw themselves. A ruler who frames every obstacle as betrayal will drown in paranoia. A ruler who frames obstacles as tests grows sharper with each one. The event itself matters less than the story told about it, and that story is always yours to control. Think of history's great leaders. Many faced exile, imprisonment, ruin. But the ones who returned stronger were those who told themselves, this is not the end. This is the preparation for a greater beginning. They starve fear by starving despair of its story. You can do the same. When you feel fear rising, interrogate the frame. What story am I telling myself? What if I shift it? Turn I failed into. I discovered a strategy that doesn't work. Turn they rejected me into. They revealed their taste is limited. Turn this scares me into. This points me toward growth. Reframing is not lying to yourself. It is choosing sovereignty over your narrative. And narrative is what the nervous system obeys. If you frame the same sensation as danger, your body trembles. If you frame it as excitement, your body energizes. The same heartbeat, the same breath, two different commands. This is why Machiavelli's conditioning was not only external, but internal. He trained the mind to reinterpret, to spin, to weaponize perspective. Because when you own perception, you own experience. And when you own experience, fear cannot touch you. The average man obeys the story given to him. The Machiavellian man writes the story others are forced to read. And the difference between them is not reality, it is perception. So the eighth discipline is this: bend the story before it bends you. Reframe every strike as fuel. Recast every fear as a signal. Rewrite every loss as a weapon. Do this and the world stops controlling your nerves. You control your nerves and through them the world. The ninth layer of conditioning is mastery of repetition. Nothing rewires the mind faster than ritual. Not talent, not inspiration, ritual. The brain doesn't change because you know something. It changes because you practice something until it becomes automatic. And Machiavelli knew that the man who controls his habits controls his destiny. Fear thrives when action is inconsistent. You face it once, then retreat. You try today, but you skip tomorrow. Inconsistency tells the brain this is dangerous. We must avoid it. But when you confront fear, daily ritual kills the signal. The brain reclassifies the threat as normal. And what is normal can no longer terrify. This is why soldiers drill endlessly, why fighters spar relentlessly, why orators rehearse until words flow like water. It isn't about skill alone. It's about making fear irrelevant through sheer familiarity. Repetition is exposure multiplied until the nerves surrender. Machiavelli would argue repetition is not glamorous, but it is the foundation of power. One victory means nothing. A pattern of victories creates inevitability, and inevitability terrifies enemies more than strength. Because strength can falter, but inevitability feels unstoppable. So how do you apply this? You build daily rituals of confrontation. If fear of rejection owns you, you practice small rejections every day until no becomes meaningless. If fear of speaking paralyzes you, you speak in small rooms, then larger ones, until the stage feels like home. If fear of loss rules you, you deliberately let go of small things, training the mind to survive without clinging. Each repetition is a scar, and scars are the proof of transformation. But here's the subtlety: repetition without awareness is wasted. You must reflect after each exposure. Ask, what did I feel? What weakened? What remained? This reflection engraves the lesson deeper. Without reflection, ritual is empty. With reflection, ritual is alchemy. Over time, repetition changes identity itself. You stop saying, I am afraid. You start saying, I am the kind of person who acts regardless. And that identity is unshakable. Because while emotions fluctuate, identity holds. This is why most men never escape fear. They flirt with action, but never marry it. They try once, get burned, retreat, and reinforce the program. But the Machiavellian embraces repetition. He knows that the first attempts will sting. He knows the scars will come, but he also knows that with enough scars, the skin becomes armor. So the ninth discipline is this: build the ritual, repeat the assault, scar the mind until fear has nowhere left to live. Because the man who acts daily without pause, without retreat, doesn't just face fear, he erases it from the nervous system. The 10th and final layer of conditioning is sovereignty, the moment fear stops being your master and becomes your servant. By now you've dissected it, exposed it, reframed it, and scarred it through repetition. Fear still exists, but it no longer commands. It whispers, but you no longer bow. And this shift creates something most men will never taste: total mental freedom. Sovereignty doesn't mean recklessness. It doesn't mean you charge blindly into danger. It means you choose. Fear may appear, but you decide whether it matters. You weigh it like data. You treat it like weather, sometimes inconvenient, never paralyzing. And because you choose, you are free. Machiavelli would call this the highest form of rule: self-rule. The man who conquers cities but cannot conquer his nerves is still a slave. The man who bends others but cannot bend his own mind is still weak. But the man who governs himself cannot be governed. He is unshakable, untouchable, and immune to manipulation. This sovereignty radiates in every arena of life. In business, people sense you cannot be pressured by urgency or scarcity. You move on your own time. In relationships, they sense you cannot be guilted or controlled. You love freely, but never out of fear. In conflict, enemies sense you cannot be intimidated. They realize your silence is more terrifying than their noise. And here lies the ultimate paradox: once you stop fearing fear, you stop fearing life. The same energy that once shackled you becomes fuel. Fear becomes the compass, pointing you to growth. Fear becomes the forge where identity hardens. Fear becomes the test that separates the ordinary from the sovereign. Machiavelli would tell you this: most men die long before their bodies fail. They die the moment fear becomes their ruler. But a rare few, the ones who condition their minds like steel, become immortal long before death arrives. Not because they live forever, but because their impact does. Their presence lingers. Their silence echoes. Their absence still commands. This is the destiny of sovereignty: to walk through life untethered, to see fear, smile at it, and move anyway, to act without hesitation, to speak without apology, to build without begging. Not because you're fearless, but because you're free. And when that day comes, when fear finally bends its knee, you will understand what true power feels like. Not control over others, not applause, not wealth, but something infinitely rarer: complete dominion over yourself. That is the crown most men never wear. That is the empire most men never build. And once you've built it, no one can take it from you.